What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Must-own running backs August update. This is one of the most useful videos on the channel, and I did this video back in June as well, but things have, of course, changed since then, right? ADPs have moved around, we've got new news coming out, and we've sort of figured out the best overall draft strategy for this season. So I wanted to make an update on the best running backs to target at different portions of the drafts, but also focusing heavily on the portions of a draft that you are looking at running back, taking into account when you want to target that position, what other running backs are available at that portion of the draft. And so I think this is going to be a really good video because it's nice to know that I like certain running backs, but you want to know when would I also draft them? Because I can love a running back, but just really hate where they go, and not even at the running backs around that spot. I can have a running back ranked 2 spots above where you would actually get him, but not actually even want to take that running back because maybe the wide receivers, the tight ends, or the quarterbacks in that range I want instead. So this video goes over players that I also want to draft for where they're going. So we're going to talk about that in a second, but we've got to do the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was which quarterback had the lowest percentage of aggressive plays downfield. The answer was Derek Carr. And of course, talking about 2019 on that one. Today's stat, which running back ranked dead last in yards over replacement level player? So before we talk about the first player, a quick note on draft strategy. I mentioned that a second ago. It's fairly clear at this point in the offseason, the optimal strategy is to take 3 running backs in those first 4 rounds. You do not necessarily need it to be like a certain order, right? You don't need it to be running back, wide receiver. You can start off wide receiver in the first round, if you're getting Michael Thomas or Adams, basically. You can grab a high-end running back in the second and the third and the fourth. It doesn't really matter, but you probably want to start off with 3 running backs in those first 4 rounds, then essentially just loading up on wide receivers in rounds 4 through 8, again, round 4, depending on what you did in the first 3 rounds, and then taking your quarterback, your defense, your tight end, all in the later rounds. That just seems like the optimal build this season. So I want to include running backs in this video that are going to fit in with that strategy. So I want to include running backs that are going in these first 4 rounds and then rounds like 9 on. So since that kind of takes out the middle rounds, I do want to mention the running backs I love in that range just because you might have to take some running backs there and there might be great value. So if you see Jonathan Taylor, David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, Kareem Hunt, any of those guys, if they become a value, take them. I love all of those running backs. I think they all have incredible upside and a really, really nice floor to where if you're looking running back with a pick and that guy is one of the best available, perfectly comfortable taking them and sort of abandoning this sort of strategy. Or maybe there were 2 wide receivers in those first 4 rounds where you're like, I need the value on these guys. Take one of these instead of a wide receiver in the middle rounds. But again, optimally, we want these wide receivers in the middle rounds. So I tend to not have as many of these guys. But you know what? I still end up with Taylor and Montgomery and Hunt on a lot of teams. Swift I haven't been getting as much, but honestly, I think I moved him up pretty recently. So maybe in some future mock drafts, I'll end up with him on my team. But all those 4, absolutely love them. Still want to get them on my team. And especially once you leave that range, it's a dead zone for running backs. So if you get to like those kind of 4 players and you're looking at your next pick and running back is kind of iffy after that point and you don't have 4, like you only have 3, I probably would take one of them. Just make sure you don't leave like Kareem Hunt. After that, it's a cliff. And you want 4 running backs at that point. But anyway, that's enough about the draft strategy. Let's talk about some of the players I liked. And we are going to go over a little bit more, not as much about each player specifically, about the players around them as well, at least for these first two players. So first up, we have Miles Sanders, and you guys know that I absolutely love him this season. If you're drafting on Fantasy Pros, he's going to cost you a late first round pick, sometimes into the early second round. But in best ball drafts and on Sleeper, it's usually the early second round. On ESPN, Yahoo, Fantasy Football Calculator, it's more in like the late second round. I have a feeling overall, let's say we're in early September, on average, he's going to fall at the turn. I really think he's going to go in that like 11 through 15 kind of range. So you're going to be targeting him when you have a late first round pick. So let's talk about him, assuming that's the case. At that point in the draft, the tier 1 running backs are gone, and likely both of Michael Thomas and Adams are also gone. It is possible you're in the late first round and Adams is still there. And if he is, I am very okay taking him. And then honestly, you could also just pair him with Miles Sanders as well, because you're looking at that like 11 or 12 pick. And, it's possible if you're at 12, you just take Adams and Sanders. But we'll get to that. But typically, your decision when it comes down to picks 10, 11, 12, for me, it's Adams. It's Sanders, it's Drake, and the other running backs you're looking at are typically Chubb, Josh Jacobs, Austin Eckler, Aaron Jones. So that's kind of what the decision comes down to. And when I look at Miles Sanders, I see a guy that has a higher reception ceiling than Nick Chubb and than Josh Jacobs. And he also has a much greater yardage ceiling than Austin Eckler, and far less competition for touches and a much higher touch ceiling than Jones. So you look at those 4 players I just mentioned, Chubb, Sanders, Eckler, and Jones, and you say he beats them in a number of different categories. So those guys I feel are more mid-second round picks. So for me, this decision, when you're drafting in the late first round, it comes down to, do you want Sanders, Drake, or Adams? That's basically what it comes down to. I did a video where I broke down that exact decision, at least between Sanders and Drake, and we came to the conclusion that Sanders is slightly safer and that his medium outcome is slightly higher. And so given that they do have pretty much the same ceiling, I do lean Sanders. We know the talent is there. We know the opportunity is there. He, again, is one of the safest running backs. I believe my third safest, either second or third safest running back in the entire draft. So I am leaning Sanders over Drake. But again, if you're drafting at this portion of the draft, you have 2 picks really close to each other. So I really want to, if I'm in that range, get 2 of Adams, Sanders, and Drake. So I guess you could include Drake in this video. But again, I prefer Sanders. And another note, like I said earlier, the ADP is different. I mean, if you're on ESPN, Yahoo, NFL, he's coming much closer to the mid-second or even the late second round. And that's just an absolute steal, because you should not be able to pair Miles Sanders with like the low-end tier 1 of running back. That's just an absolute steal. But let's move on to a running back that goes a little bit later, and someone that I actually haven't mentioned enough. I haven't mentioned that many times. He's been ranked above ADP, above ECR for I think like the whole summer. I just haven't had a chance to talk about him too much, and that's James Conner. I have him as the running back 16, the 28th overall player. So that's like the early third round kind of range. But that beats basically every single site where you can get him. The earliest he's going is in FFPC drafts in the early third round, but he goes in the late third on Fantasy Football Calculator. He goes in the early 4th round on NFL and Yahoo, the mid 4th round on CBS, the early 5th round on ESPN and Best Ball Drafts. So there's a very wide range of rounds where he's going, just depending on what platform you're using. So it is a little bit tougher to know exactly who he's going next to, because again, it'll depend. Are you on ESPN or are you drafting the FFPC? Like, it depends where you're drafting. but it's certainly the range where the tier 1 and tier 2 running backs are gone. He's definitely not going in that same range of, like I said before, with Chubb and Jones and Eckler. He is going later than them, and it's very likely the top 7 or 8 wide receivers are gone, and then very likely Kittle and Kelsey are gone, and probably Mahomes and Lamar. So we're basically looking at top 2 tight end, top 2 quarterback, top 7 or 8 wide receiver, and the first 2 tiers of running backs all gone. So you get to this point, and you look at running backs, and everyone has question marks. Some of these guys are changing teams. Some are coming off injury. We've got a rookie in Jonathan Taylor, who I mentioned I really like, but again, we have a rookie and another rookie, I guess, in DeAndre Swift. And since everyone has question marks in this range, we care a little bit less about the injuries with Connor, because realistically, that's the only thing keeping him out of the second round. Because most people forget, but James Conner was a top 10 pick last year after finishing 2018 with 19.4 points per game. You know what 19.4 would have ranked last season among all running backs? Second, behind only Christian McCaffrey. I mean, think about that. In 2018, on a per-game basis, James Conner had a better season than Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, and Aaron Jones last year. And while he wasn't great last year, talking about James Conner, he was still 18th in points per game, even while playing injured for most of the season, and with the Steelers ranking 27th in points per game. I mean, try to think back to what we saw and what we experienced with James Conner last season. Gets the knee sprain in week 2, the ankle sprain in week 5, the quad strain in week 6. He played through all of these injuries and was a running back 13 over that time. Then he missed 5 games with the AC joint sprain, another with a quad contusion. So he really only played 8 full games. And many of those games were limited because he had these injuries. They couldn't play him, 90% of the snaps. And yet, he still secured 34 receptions, which is 1 less than Mixon, 2 fewer than Chubb, who played all 16 weeks, and he managed 7 touchdowns with an absolute dumpster fire at quarterback. So when we look ahead to this season, we have Big Ben coming back. We've got Juju presumably being fully healthy. So this offense is going to be a lot better. And given that they're projected for 9 wins, that says a lot. This was not a good team last season, and Vegas is projecting 9 wins in a pretty difficult division. And as you've heard me say a lot, it's a huge boost to running backs when the offense and the team overall improves. You want running backs on teams that are going to win more games and going to score more points. So when people look at it and they say, well, Juju's coming back, maybe that steals some touchdowns. No. When you have Big Ben and Juju coming back, the offense gets a ton better. There are more yards, more touchdowns, more positive game scripts for running backs. It's overall a great situation for James Conner. So the only reason he's not going in this second round is the injuries. But while those are a concern, it's a concern for everyone in this range. I mean, maybe not just the injuries, but for Carson and David Johnson and even Melvin Gordon, these are concerns with the injury. I mean, Melvin Gordon's played more than 14 games once in 5 years. We know David Johnson has suffered a ton of injuries. Carson's coming off a major injury, but he's had so many major injuries in his career. So all these running backs going around him are also, concerns in that area. And then you've got other guys who are risks, not just with injuries, but with other areas of their game as well. So when I look at Conner, I see someone who's going to smash their ADP while healthy. And even if he misses, a few weeks here and there, that's fine. Because when I look to start him, I know he's going to be great. So I would rather, I talk about this a lot with players going later in the drafts, but it's still true for where James Conner's going. If you're going to give me 13 healthy weeks from James Conner, well, I know for 13 weeks, he's probably going to be like a low-end running back 1. So I would prefer that ahead of someone who's going to play 15 weeks, but kind of return value in all those weeks and be more of a running back 2 to a running back 3. I want someone with his ceiling, even this early, because while we're trying to avoid risk, we have to be realistic. All the running backs going in that range have their concerns. They all have question marks. So saying you can't draft him because of the injuries, well, that means you can't draft anyone after like the 4th round. Literally. So you just have to kind of overlook it a little bit if you're capturing as much upside as you are with James Conner. So that's my take on him. Some people are also going to point out that McFarland is a threat to his job. Don't worry about the other running backs in Pittsburgh, all right? Snell and Samuels were not good last season. Yes, they drafted McFarland, but he is much more of a change of pace back. He is not going to see enough work this season, especially with the limited camps, to take any sort of real workload away from Conner. He might take a small role, but that small role is going to be to keep James Conner healthy. They don't need to play him 100% of snaps. Like, I don't even want that. If I draft James Conner, I do not want him out there in every play. He's going to get hurt. So if they can bring in Anthony McFarland to just take a little bit of the workload away from him and keep him healthy, that's a positive thing for James Conner. I want him to stay healthy because he's going to smash while he's healthy. So those are 2 of my favorite early round picks at the running back position. I guess 3 if you want to count Drake in there because I love him as well. And then remember, when we transition to the middle rounds, it's Jonathan Taylor, it's David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, Kareem Hunt, all those guys that I love as well. And for the final rounds, I have 2 players to go over that I think the narrative is similar for both of them, and that's Darrell Henderson and Zach Moss. These 2 definitely go in different rounds depending on the site, but in general, if you want these guys on your team, you're going to spend roughly like a 10th to a 12th round pick on average for these 2. They don't typically go too much earlier or too much later than that. They're usually in that range. And I mentioned them both together because the case for them is a little bit similar. Both of them are going late because the public is viewing Singletary and Akers as the lead backs in their backfields. And so these 2 are being taken more as handcuffs. But they're absolutely more than that. Henderson didn't play much last season, but it was reported that he needed some time to learn the blocking scheme, and they did have Todd Gurley. So while it was true that Todd Gurley was a very large risk, so Henderson had a lot of upside if Gurley went down, while Gurley was healthy, it was pretty clear that he was still the guy. We learned that very early in the season. They did still want to lean on Gurley as much as they could while he was healthy. But at his ADP, it seems to assume that Akers is going to step in and just be the lead back, but that's just not true. Even McVay has said that they want to use their running backs like San Fran did last season, rolling with the hot hand and mixing in Akers and Henderson, in and out of the game, and just kind of going with who's producing better that game, who's better in that matchup. And that's great news for Henderson and bad news for Akers, because Akers goes kind of early in drafts. And so if you're spending an earlier pick on a guy who is in this committee with Henderson and is going to be having some games where he's the backup. Like, there are going to be games where Akers is only getting 8 carries because Henderson's doing great and they're going to leave Henderson in. If that's the situation in the backfield, I want the one going second. I don't want the one going first, even if you think the one going first is a little bit more talented. Another thing I want to mention is people are viewing this team like it's not as great on offense. People aren't very excited to get the backfield here, but can we just remember that the Rams made the Super Bowl in 2018, averaging over 30 points per game. They were, I believe, number 2 behind Kansas City that season. No one's going to be surprised if they bounce back this season and post 30 points per game yet again. So there's a chance you're getting potentially the lead running back on a top-tier offense in the double-digit rounds. That should never happen, but I think just people are just done with Henderson after one season of a dud. I mean, it was obviously a dud season. He barely had any carries, but he wasn't that bad with the carries he was given. He looked pretty good. He looked like he did have a lot of bursts, and if you're going to give me that in the double-digit rounds when the success rate is already like 20%, I want that upside absolutely every single time. And you know what? If it doesn't work out, I've got a guy that I can just dump for whoever's hot on free agency. But I really think we need to be taking him much earlier than we are. As for Moss, I don't think it's a secret, that I think he's better than Singletary. His athletic measurements are not great. He does not have a good speed score. He did not have a great combine. But he was incredible in college, and he is an amazing receiving back. And while the public seems to think that Singletary is just some incredible receiving back as well, it's not true. Singletary's not good in the receiving game. He saw his targets drop in all 3 seasons at college, finishing with a 4% target share in his final year. Then he was incredibly inefficient in the passing game as a rookie, finishing with 6.7 yards per reception, 4.7 yards per target, which ranked 28th and 32nd among 35 running backs with at least 40 targets. And while it's easy to, just take the easy way out and say, well, it was because of Josh Allen, right? He's not super accurate. What's the excuse for the low yards per reception then? If Allen's not accurate, okay. But when he does connect with him, shouldn't he do something with those receptions if he's such a good receiving back? But he didn't. I think people look back at the playoff game and they're like, oh, well, yeah, that happened most of the season, right? But it didn't. And even in the playoff game, almost all of his receiving production came off one big play in the fourth quarter and another in overtime. But other than those 2 plays, he wasn't used much in the receiving game at all last season. And, his best 2 games were like 6 for 26 and 3 for 45. That's not that great. In Graham Barfield, he charts yards per route run for college running backs, and he doesn't do all of them, but he does, the ones that are going to be relevant, right? The ones that are actually going to be drafted and actually going to be used in the NFL. And over the last 5 seasons, Moss ranks 3rd behind Kamara and Mixon. That's it. The only running backs that rank higher in yards per route run than Zach Moss over the last 5 years, Alvin Kamara and Joe Mixon. That is it. You know who ranks dead last among all those running backs? Devin Singletary. And then what does Singletary come out and do in his first season as a pro? He ranks 36 out of 39 qualified running backs in the yards per route run last season. I genuinely don't understand why people think Singletary is such a good receiving back. He's not. And why would they use Singletary in the receiving game over Zach Moss? It makes absolutely no sense. Moss is one of the better receiving backs we've seen over the last few years, and Singletary is one of the worst. I don't know what's going through people's minds. So knowing this, and also knowing that Moss is going to take over the Frank Gore role, which means, people are like, oh, well, that means he's going to be Frank Gore. No, the Frank Gore role means when they get in the red zone, it's Zach Moss time. Singletary was not used at all in the red zone last season. He had 1 goal line carry all year, even taking over the role practically completely from Gore. They would still bring Gore in the red zone. So Zach Moss has a higher receiving ceiling. He's got way more touchdown upside, and yet he's going significantly later in drafts than Singletary. That makes no sense. I don't understand it at all. So you got to be targeting Moss every single time. If he's available in the double-digit rounds, that's absurd. You got to take him. So those are my must-own running backs for the 2020 fantasy football season. If you want to see my full list of players to target, as well as the players I'm avoiding, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? But thanks for watching.